Everybody to today's Superintendent's Budget Advisory Task Force. Today's January 24th, 2022, and we have an hour meeting scheduled for today. We've shared the agenda, and linked on that agenda are our norms and our purpose and goals. And what we're going to do is jump right into our budget update to see what kind of discussion we generate, questions or feedback for myself that I can carry forward to our trustees that we get from this budget update. And before I turn it over to Associate Superintendent Pfeiffer, the budget update that we'll be looking at is the governor's January budget proposal. And many of you on this call are certainly very familiar with that budgeting cycle. But as a reminder, as a refresher, if you're not familiar with that, the governor releases his budget in January. There's a lot of legislative work that happens between now and May, and legislative work is also a nice way of saying advocacy at the state level. And the next step in the process will be to have the governor's May revision posted. And so this is what we have in the moment. And this is generally a collection of information that we've received from School Services of California. And it may also include some reference points from Capital Advisors, which are two leading agencies in breaking down the governor's budget proposal. So with that, I'll turn it over to Associate Superintendent Pfeiffer. And then after she finishes this presentation, we'll open it up for questions, comments, concerns, or general feedback from the task force.
Thank you, Superintendent Kamek. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present this information to all of you. In general, the state budget is showing a robust financial outlook for the 22-23 fiscal year. It's showing that the state will have a surplus of $45.7 billion in additional funding. And so while there's definitely a lot of positive economic indicators, please keep in mind that this surplus happened right before the new variant of COVID-19. And so that might have a bit of an impact on the actual results. The January budget is his first presentation, as Superintendent Kamek said, but there's a lot that happens between now and the final budget between now and May. So these are the things we want to keep an eye on. Inflation continues to be a concern. And as you know, there's the possibility that the Federal Reserve may increase the interest rates, and that has a negative impact also on the finances of the state. So of that $45.7 billion surplus, he's divided that funding in three different buckets. One of them is $20.6 billion in discretionary, $9 billion in reserves and in debt reduction. And the most important to us, of course, is public education. So he's investing of the proposing to invest of the $45.7 billion, $16.1 billion in education. How does he break that down for us in education? Where are we going to see this money? Well, there's a grant that's Expanded Learning Opportunity Program. This is very different than ELOG, the Expanded Learning Opportunity Grant. This is specific to districts in the state of California having to extend their 6-hour day to 9-hour days. This is a program that is not optional. The district doesn't have the option not to participate. Unless there's a decision not to, then the money goes back, but we don't have the option of not participating. So there's a large amount of money that's coming the district's way, $2.5 million to get this program off on its feet and moving forward. So there's money coming to the district for that. The COLA increase from 2.85 to 5.33%. He's estimating that he's going to fund a higher COLA. As you know, this year, students are eating at no cost to themselves. We're getting reimbursement from the state and the federal government. Well, the state is now saying that it's going to put money aside to be able to continue to offer free meals to all students. In addition, they are requiring that we provide 2 meals for students. And and I'll get into more detail when we get to that. So $650 million for universal access to meals, $640 million for transitional kinder expansion, $500 million to increase special education-based funding, $295 million to add 5.33% COLA to certain categorical programs, $3.1 billion that's going into Prop 98 reserves, $2 billion of one-time college and career pathways, $1.5 billion in support to transportation electronic buses, and $1.3 billion to support school facilities programs. So as we go through these slides, I'll expand a little bit more on this. So the funding of, it's $3 billion, as I said, 3.3 for COLA. Then there's the local control funding formula. So he's putting in $70.5 billion. So what does that equate to? An average, statewide average per pupil increase, it's $587. And this is, there's also a proposed change so that in the declining enrollment, we will have an average of 3 years instead of hold harmless. The minimum guarantee, which is the highest that districts have seen in many years, at $101 billion in 22-23, which is, we can't receive less than this amount. And you can see that there's definitely a huge increase by over 426% from where we started in back in 1988, 1989. The next slide is one that I wanted to share with you because it really hits to the heart of declining enrollment. And this is specific to the largest counties in Santa Clara.
Nancy,
yes.
I apologize to interrupt. I don't know if it's just my view of what's happening, but I'm not seeing any slides advance. And so I don't.
That's correct for me too.
Oh, none of them?
No, we are still seeing the title slide.
I'm seeing, oh, okay.
There you go.
It's moving. Is it better?
Yes.
It's now showing slide 7, which is referring to declining enrollment.
Okay, I apologize. I have no way of knowing what you're seeing. Thank you for
That's
letting me
okay.
know.
It may be helpful just for the visual aid to go through some of the earlier slides to give
Sure.
context to
Can you
what
see
you were
this one?
saying. Yeah, I'm seeing slide 6 now
Okay.
and 5.
There we go. So this is the second slide after the title. So these are so this is the title page. This is what I was referring to as far as the $45.7 billion in general fund surplus, where he's putting that $45.7 billion, 16.1 coming to education, how he's spending that $16.1 billion. It's listed by category. We're talking, so now I'm taking each category and referring to it. So in the local control funding formula, the COLA represents about an additional $587 per student for our statewide average. Our number might be a little bit different than other districts in California. The slide that I was talking about, Proposition 98, Proposition 98 is a guarantee that a district will not receive less than that. And it's receiving the new heights of $102 billion in 22-23. Since the passage of Proposition 98, it's increased over 426%. So these are all good indicators. Nobody's refuting that. Declining enrollment projections is one that this particular slide looks at 10 counties in California, ours being the Alameda County, and our declining enrollment is showing 6%. Statewide average for California is 8.7%, but there are other counties in the state of California that are declining in enrollment at a greater pace than we are. For example, Los Angeles is at 18.9 and declining enrollment compared to the statewide average of 8.7%. So those counties are having definitely some concerns, more concerns than we do. And this is definitely a concern in the declining enrollment. But the one that really stuck to me as we were looking at these slides from School Services of California, we can look at, so the question for us is declining enrollment because of COVID? Is it declining enrollment for other reasons? Is it just us that are going to be feeling this? Well, this particular slide on the left-hand side shows the projections at the state level that we're going to decline in enrollment at the state level, more than 160,000 students in 2020, 2021. In 27, 28, we're going to be at 5.6 million students when we've been at 6.2 million students. So this decline is going to be felt across the state and not just in our county, but statewide. And that's definitely something to be watching. So one of the things that is a welcome difference in the budgets that we've seen in the past and now is that when there's a problem with enrollment and there's a declining enrollment, school districts have to deal with it. And in this particular case, we have a two whammy. One of them is the declining enrollment as a whole, but the second piece is the declining in ADA. So what does that mean? We get funded based on the days that the students come to school, not the number of students that are enrolled. So if our students are not coming to school because of COVID, not only are we impacted by the decline in enrollment, but we're also impacted by their attendance, and therefore we have a double hit, the decline in enrollment hit and the ADA to enrollment percentage. So is the state going to do anything about that concern we have? Yes, they are looking at, and this is the welcome news, because without that, it's going to be very difficult for school districts in the state of California to stay financially solvent. Currently, the district has a hold harmless, or the state offers a hold harmless, which is the prior year, the current or prior year, whichever is greater. What they're proposing is for us to have a 3-year average, current year plus 2 prior years, and to see which one is higher for us. This is a welcome news because to start off, we are able to use 2 years as a hold harmless year, and the only year that will have an impact on us is this year. Without this, we're looking at a net impact of 3 actual years of loss in enrollment. So if this goes through, this is going to be really, really good for all the districts that are having problems with decline in enrollment. There's another concern about the reserve cap. The reserve cap is that all of the parameters that need to be met, the thresholds that needed to be met to trigger a cap that cannot exceed 10% will be triggered starting next year. So as of next year, school districts should not have more than a 10% reserve in their budgets. So we're watching that very closely and to make sure that we don't have that issue. So school facility programs, there's 2 of them, which is the California Preschool Transitional Kinder and Full Day Kinder Facilities Program. We're very interested in that. We want to hopefully get some funding for our district so that we can add more classrooms so that we can offer all-day kinder. And there's also funding for eligibility construction for modernization projects. And the district has been taking advantage of this funding. Universal TK, you may have heard that the district is going to have to is required to offer transitional kinder for students at a younger age, to the point that at 25, 26, we should offer transitional kinder to 3-year-olds whose fourth birthday occurs by September 1st. So the district is having to prepare for universal transitional kinder. And the concern with this particular program is that not only are we bringing students earlier, but it also has a 10-to-1 ratio. So these classrooms are going to have an increase in staffing where it could be either 2 teachers or a teacher and a paraprofessional, because these students have to have a student to adult ratio of only 10 students. So the student nutrition program, as we talked about a little bit ago, is also a program where the governor is planning to set money aside, and that's to help us with a new requirement of providing 2 meals a day for students. And that is going to be definitely a costly proposition. However, he has set money aside to support that effort. So the next steps for us is not for us, but at the state level, there's going to be budget committee hearings. And that's when all of the interested parties, all of the advocacy groups start reaching out to the governor and starts looking at all of that excess, the surplus money, and each of them are going to want to have their own piece of the pie. So what we have now and what we will end up in May is not necessarily going to be the same thing, because the lobbyists and the advocacy groups will be reaching out to the legislatures and also the governor as to where they would rather see the money spent. We should have the May revise on or before May 15. That's an important date for us, because that really gives us the final numbers of what to expect in the state budget and what to expect as a district. We basically have 30 days from that May revise to finalize the district budget. And then late in June, early July, we see the actual workshop where the state governors approve their budget. We, the district, has to have our budget approved prior to June 30th, and they have to have it by June 30th, but we'll see the workshop early in July to see how well we did with our final budget adoption. I want to give credit to School Services of California for their slides, and open it to any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Nancy. If individuals on the call today want to just raise their hand via the Zoom feature, we'll go through questions, comments, concerns, ideas, brainstorming that way. As you're considering those topics, just for some additional context, where we are within Fremont Unified, our next budget item that comes to the board, well, there will be a couple things. In Wednesday's meeting, we'll review this presentation publicly and with our board to provide our trustees, 2 of whom are with us today, an update on the governor's budget proposal. Then we will present our second interim, and that's our second progress report of our budget for the year. And we're already starting to receive publications from school services about things to consider in your second interim. And this is a really great time, but it's a unique time, right? So we're hearing about fantastic budget news at the state level, and we certainly are pleased to hear that. Now the question is, when and how do we start calculating those into our projections, and how realistic do they become? And I'm excited to see what happens. And I think we've talked on this call a lot about advocacy. And this is a place where, just as an example, I don't ever want to say it's not good enough, but it looks like they're really starting to listen to some of the suggested changes around funding school districts related to their enrollment versus their ADA. We're not seeing everything we want to see there yet, but this would also be a good example. I'll be meeting with an assembly member in the next few weeks where I'm going to advocate for another year of hold harmless. We all have seen what's happened with the surge of Omicron, and we really need, in my opinion, another year of hold harmless, because there's enough one-time revenue, I think, at the state level to support districts in that. So as you're thinking about those topics, that's kind of where we are. And then obviously a lot to discuss at the state level. Sometimes when there's no money in the state budget, there's still a lot of advocacy because people are fighting for a really small piece of the pie. But it really cranks up in this type of a year where there's way more revenue than is anticipated, and there's a lot of people who want to draw down a portion of that state level revenue. So turning to our group, the first hand I see raised is Trustee Jones.
Thank you, and I apologize for being late. So I apologize if I'm asking a question that was answered. But as good as all of this looks, we keep hearing about inflation, and inflation is maybe higher than what COLA is. And of course, we're impacted by inflation. And I'm wondering, I know historically speaking, there are parts of our budget where we typically see the costs of those items really outpacing any COLA that we ever get. And I'm wondering if we're projecting kind of something similar in this coming year, where we know, say, special ed or STRS PERS, the increases to those costs are going to be higher than even what COLA is. Is that something that we know yet or have a sense of?
So a couple of things there, Trustee Jones, great questions. The first one, in terms of PERS and STRS, in the past years, especially for our astute members on this call, they may recognize that the governor has proposed temporary buy downs of those increased rates to help give some school districts relief. That's not in this proposal from the governor. We'll see if that comes into some action based on the advocacy of different groups or legislative work. I know there's a lot of people at the state looking at that. If they don't change, we do know our percentages. And Nancy, I'm not sure, in terms of the discussion that's happening with CBOs at the county level or at the state level, if they're talking about considerations. I just saw an email come through from school services while we were on this call. I haven't opened it yet, but it's referring to considerations for a second interim. And that may be where, Trustee Jones, they're advising about CPI, inflation, and other things that we may need to take into account. Because as much as we appreciate the COLA, you're correct in that we still operate in the same economic system where if the costs of goods and services go up, we will feel that in a similar fashion. Nancy?
Yes, the primary concern, of course, for us is STRS and PERS, one of them. But the higher concern is that our employees, the money that they're earning is not, you're not able to purchase the goods and services that you were able to do so 3 or 4 years ago. So while the district may receive a COLA, you have to subtract from the COLA things like the increased cost in STRS and PERS, the increased cost in step and column. And then what's left is what you end up looking at, what we can do for compensation. And that's not enough to keep up with the pace of the increases in cost for our employees. So the more we see an increase on the base, the more we can lobby the governor to put more one-time money into reducing the STRS and PERS liability for school districts, so that if he can reduce a 1% or 2% of those increases, that will help us increase our base, because our base is going to those things. So these are mandated at the state level that we have no choice. That needs to be paid first before anything else gets paid. So if we can advocate, one, for the hold harmless to be extended 1 more year, that's going to help our base, with a caveat that the next year we do the 3-year average, 1 more year hold harmless, then absolutely we want the 3-year state average. And then the next thing is for him to use one-time monies or ongoing money if possible to reduce that liability that he has transferred over from the state's responsibility to school districts that we're supposed to pay for our employees. If he could do those 2 things on top of everything else he proposed, I think we will be in better shape to help our employees, not circumvent, but try to minimize the impact that this escalation in cost is having in their families.
Right. And I think, one of the things that was mentioned at a budget workshop I attended last week was an expected real significant increase in PG&E costs in the double digits. So that was concerning, because as great as what seems like a large COLA, as great as it sounds, when you look at some of the way other costs are increasing, it becomes discouraging. And I think, this is also, and maybe you have a sense of this too, because we're going to have an opportunity to do some advocacy at the federal level when it comes to special ed funding in particular. That's an area that the federal government has never funded adequately. And if they were to come through with some of that, that would also put us in a better position to really make better use of the COLA. If we had that alleviated, is that something that's also worth pursuing? Is that kind of federal advocacy, especially for SPED?
Absolutely.
Okay.
If I may, I'm sorry. Superintendent Kamick.
Oh, you're 100% right, Nancy. It's absolutely worth pursuing. It's absolutely underfunded. I've probably said it here many times that it is intended to be funded at 40% from the federal government. I've never seen it surpass 15%. And so if we saw an increase in that, it would be significant. In this last year, I think is one of the first times I've actually seen that concept even discussed at the federal level with any sort of depth or traction. How much traction, I don't know, and how much they can get accomplished at the federal level under that context remains to be seen. But certainly worth continuing to advocate for that, because it would make a big difference. And I wanted to add, we really, I think, enjoy the idea of this average over 3 years of our attendance. But one of the things that's going in discussion points out there is that it removes the concern of declining enrollment. And I think what's important to remember is we looked at kind of a cliff earlier, where if we kept using the higher of the last few years, at some point, we'd have to pay the piper. And so it's not that cliff goes away, it just becomes a much more gradual slope downward. And so I think, we've done some responsible budgeting to try and account for that in the out years. It's in our first interim. And so we want to be mindful of that, but it certainly softens that trajectory downward. And of course, we would hope that we find ourselves in Fremont no longer declining in enrollment and finding just the right amount of study growth that our facilities can handle that. But it's an important note, because it does provide some reliefs to school districts across the state, but it doesn't eliminate the concern. So other questions, comments, concerns, or in general, what we look at here is we're grateful to have 2 trustees with us, but if there were other things that you wanted the remainder of the board to hear from you as a task force, are there discussion points or strategies that you'd like to see us begin implementing? Susan, I see your hand up.
Thank you. In looking at the slides, number 8, the 2022-2023 ADA cliff, that's really concerning. And like you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's state level data, correct?
That is correct.
I would like to see Fremont with the same years in a graph to see how our, sorry, I had my phone on while I was muted. I would like to see how our district is losing students over the same period of time from 2015 till currently, and see what those anticipated projections are for in the future. Because as you know, some districts are losing more students at a higher rate than other districts. And I don't know how ours compares to the general average, if that's the right word to use, as far as declining enrollment.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, and we can likely gather that data relatively quickly. It was part of our demographic report, which was presented maybe a month or so ago. But these days, I'm not sure the way all the dates blend together. But it is a good thing for us to look at, and as you pointed out, different districts have different trends. In Fremont, from my observation, still being a relative newcomer, we have been able to stave off the statewide decline in enrollment longer than most districts. But in the last few years, it's finally caught up to Fremont. And so it's a good thing for us to be monitoring. And our demographers did do a projection for us over the next few years of what that might look like. So we can certainly look at pulling that together. And Trustee Campbell, I see your hand.
I apologize for being late also, and I also apologize if this question has been asked and answered. I was just looking at slide number 4, and I know I've been a bit concerned about this forever and ever, is that, lots of these projected spending looks really, really good in terms of what the governor is going to actually be rolling into school districts across the state. to be able to help us with some of our, very pressing and urgent needs that we have for our students. However, as you can see, a great deal of this is either short-term or one-time money. And so as we begin to look at our 3-year projections that we're required to do, we have to really be mindful of the fact that this isn't long-term funding. It's not going to roll over year for year for year. So I guess my question would be, what are our plans? Because most of the data that I'm seeing here is statewide data. It's not necessarily reflective in the budget for Fremont Unified. And so I'm just wondering how does this filter down for us? And is that something that we're going to be talking about on Wednesday?
Thanks, Trustee Campbell. Great questions. Ultimately, what we will do is look at the governor's proposal, and then when we start to build next year's budget, and we may, and I'll defer to Associate Superintendent Pfeiffer on some more detail on this, but based on the recommendations of school services, the Legislative Analyst's Office, and the County Office of Education, we may factor some of these things into our second interim. But ultimately, as we've seen over the years, when we see this many one-time dollars coming forward, what we generally do is account for that in our projection in 1 year, and then when we know it sunsets, we then pull it out in the other year. So in some cases, it can make our reserve look a little bigger than it is. And then in the out years, that reserve goes back down because those revenues come out. Most of these are going to be associated with plans that have to be board approved. So that'll be another element that we continue to talk about in the boardroom. For example, the new ELOP, which is different than the ELOG. So the new ELOP program would require an approved plan. And then we would also be looking at a number of these one-time dollars and making sure that we're being very mindful of how we account for them in 1 year, and then if they have a sunset date, then out the next. Nancy, are there other things that we'd be looking at? And before I turn to you, Trustee Campbell, to when we would talk about those in the boardroom, it likely would be.
Is that, well, there's several things that are one-time in nature. The proposed increases that impact our base funding, our local control funding formula, are ongoing, which are good news. So for example, the 5.33% COLA is ongoing. It helps our base. The universal access to meals, if they can continue to pay for the cost of the meals, then there won't be an increase in encroachment to the general fund, which is also good news for us. The transitional kinder expansion, they're looking at offering to pay for the second person that's going to be providing that needs to be added to the classroom. So that seems to be ongoing. So the ones that are one-time in nature, the Prop 98 reserve, that's helpful at the state level, because if the state has a stable budget, then the likelihood that we will have cuts is a lot less likely. So the more they put into the reserves, then the more they can tap into the reserves before they come and start making adjustments to our base. So that's good for them to put one-time monies into those types of reserves. College and career pathways, it's like a categorical program. Now, remember that local control funding formula was supposed to take away all of these categorical programs, and everything was supposed to be rolled into the base. Well, the expanded learning opportunity program is not rolled into the base, right? It looks like a categorical program. So if the funding is not there, then it's not a program that we can continue to provide. The support for electric buses is also a grant type thing. So if we don't, if we apply and we get it, great. If we don't, then it's not money that is going to impact our general fund. The school facilities program, we definitely want to tap into. Anytime the state has any money to help us with facilities, we're definitely all over that. So it has a combination of things that still support our efforts. If there's money that's even one-time money that's set aside for facilities, less money we have to use from either our bonds or future bonds, right? So We are definitely monitoring which ones are one time and which ones are ongoing, and the ones that are going are definitely ongoing are definitely going to help our base.
Just a quick follow-up question with that then. So if we get the funds, you're going to set them aside for just those sort of categorical programs?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So most of this money won't necessarily go into the general fund?
Not the unrestricted side of the general fund, which
right.
is the one that we need to have. Yes, that's
Right.
absolutely.
Right, because I heard you say earlier, that's what's left to be able to give back to our employees.
Correct.
And so, but our employees need to know that even though we see this robust sort of budget, it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily on the table for, as a give back, right?
Correct, because these categorical programs come with strings attached, right? So
Mhm.
ELOP, we have to offer an additional 3 hours of instruction, or at least services, and that's a costly program. You can't say we're going to use that for increases in pay or to pay for stirs and burrs. No, we're supposed to provide a program for students. So those are restricted, they're categorical, and they're not for us to include in any of our potential to increase our ending fund balance to do anything else with them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
As we move to Trustee Jones, I think, one kind of narrative point, Trustee Campbell, that you're highlighting is when the state transitioned under Governor Brown to LCFF, the idea was really to get away from all of the categorical funding that we had been receiving. And that was part of the premise behind LCFF, right? It's locally controlled. And we know that that's not really the case because we don't have that much control about how much we get at the local level. And what we're starting to see, partly in response to COVID, but in addition, because the state has been above their revenue projections, I believe the last 2 years, we're starting to see more one-time dollars, which kind of by default are becoming mini categorical funds. And so LCFF is kind of still alive and well, but we're kind of seeing, as I describe it, LCFF with categoricals. It's just, we don't know how long the categoricals are going to continue. And so it is a good point, because the premise behind LCFF was get all the money down to local school districts, and based on the local needs, they'll make the decision on expenditures. It's changed a bit, so, but that's not unexpected. Trustee Jones.
Yeah, I think the other thing to note is, especially with some of these one-time funds that are grant-based programs, is that it sounds great, oh, we'll just apply for that and we'll get it. But what I've seen over time is a lot of these things have, like qualifications, and we don't even qualify, because some of them are limited to districts that meet a certain threshold of unduplicated students. And while it feels like we have a lot of unduplicated students, when I look at our budget compared to other districts, we actually have few unduplicated students, which means we don't even qualify for certain pots of money. So we're in this kind of no man's land when it comes to getting funding. We're not rich enough to be a basic aid district. We're not poor enough to qualify for a lot of the grant monies and one-time funds that are on the table. So it just leaves us with few options.
Yes, and I think that's part of what we may see at the state level over the next few months. There's a lot of that discussion that takes place. If you were following along, and hopefully you weren't, because it's really not that exciting and not where you need to spend your time and energy. But when the governor puts out his budget, I'm tracking a lot of what's happening not behind the scenes, but you saw a lot of the legislative analysts, you saw a lot of the legislators themselves, whether they're in the Senate or the Assembly side, compliment the governor for the budget and then say, but what about X? And so I think that's part of what we'll continue to see. And that's going to happen within education as well, right? There's going to be groups within education that are advocating for a drawdown of that funding, whether it's at the community college level, whether it's at the early education level. There's obviously a huge group that's going to be pulling for K through 14 or TK through 14 revenues to come to us. But it's going to be an interesting development at the state level. And Trustee Jones and Trustee Campbell, you have both highlighted sometimes where a lot of that adjustment happens is between the one-time dollars and what they're able to structure. So I'll be very anxious to see what the May revise looks like for that. It seems like the COLA related expenditures are going to continue, and we don't always see those attached to some of our other funding, right? Like we've had years where we get a COLA, but it's not applied to special ed. And this year, at least in the governor's proposal, the COLA is applied to special ed, which is something that we certainly want to see as well, because that helps with revenue coming into the district. Are there other questions or thoughts from the group as a whole? Other strategies that they would like the district to be thinking about? Questions, concerns, advocacy, thoughts, anything for the good of the order on the presentation or the state budget proposal in general?
Pardon me for asking this question, but on slide, the one that you have.
We just lost you.
Sorry.
That's
I'm
okay. We
sorry.
lost you after the slide number.
Sorry, it's the current one. Pardon me for asking this question. I don't know what it means. What does Proposition 98 rebenched mean, quote unquote? It's the fourth line down.
Nancy, do you want to respond to that? You're on mute, Nancy. I'm so sorry.
It's a new term in education, rebenching. It's not something that happens often, but what seems to be happening and the use of this term is transitional kindergarten is going to become part of our regular general ed education. It's no longer a new program. So rebenching just means that we have to now make part of, so if it was an outside program before, transitional kinder, they're putting it into Proposition 98 to make sure that that funding continues as an ongoing program instead of just one time.
Nancy, you may want to explain what Proposition 98 really is. Sorry, I did that too.
So Proposition 98 is a guarantee that school districts have that ensures that we won't receive less funding that we received the year before. There's a more complex explanation, but I think that for now, that's the, and I'm more than happy whoever's interested in learning the whole history about Proposition 98. I'm more than happy to have that conversation, but it's the guarantee that the districts have that the next year they won't have less than what they had the year before. And why? Because we've made commitments, we've made salary commitments. And can you imagine if we don't get at least what we were expecting the year before? So that's what that is.
And an added complication or at least notation of Prop 98 is that it takes the entire revenue for the state and it says that education gets a certain percent of it. And that's set up as a minimum. The legislation was passed under Prop 98 to set that as a floor, right? But it's been a hard fight to get people at the state level to look at something above that. There's nothing that says they can't spend more than the Prop 98 minimum. But oftentimes we've really had to fight for that, and it's kind of become the default. So we are looking for dollars that come to education above the Prop 98 minimum. And the ones that we've seen, which we will certainly not complain about, but the ones that we've seen are generally one time. And
on a couple of the areas, I'm hearing that Fremont Unified may need additional personnel. In TK, it could be a teacher, could be a paraprofessional. Also in the section about additional funding for meals and 2 meals a day provided. Someone's got to deliver them, make them, sort them, serve them, etc. on the meal end. And also if we're looking for teachers or paraprofessionals for TK, as we all know in this group, we're already facing a shortage of basically people who want to work for Fremont Unified. So as we're as we're looking at this, looking at the potential of funding, it's, we, don't get me wrong, everybody always wants a raise, but we also need bodies. We're going to need people. So we have to always keep that in the back of our mind. How are we going to work through this?
Thanks. I think that's a great point, and thank you for sharing that. That's good perspective for me as the superintendent to carry forward to our board. Certainly good things to consider with our HR team, because it is a practical reality. It's one of the things that I think COVID has put such a bright light on, as I've told a number of people at the state, you can send me more money to respond to COVID, but what I need is people. And so it's a little bit true for what we're looking at next year, because we will see that with the expansion, if we're expanding meals again, if we are expanding our TK program. And that is a unique new requirement, to require 2 adults and have that specific ratio. So definitely staffing is an important thing for us to consider moving forward. Thank you. I
have a clarifying question. I just wanted to go back to the cap, reserve cap. Was I correct in hearing that this is something that's been placed, the reserve cap is now no more than 10%? Okay, is this something that's new that the state has imposed, or?
It's a great point. Thanks for catching that. And Associate Superintendent Pfeiffer can probably explain it a little bit better, but it's new, but it's not, in the sense that it's been around, I want to say, since LCFF was implemented, but it's never been enacted. So there's certain criteria that have to happen within the economics of the state revenue and within the state budget that trigger the cap on reserves. And this is the first year that that cap has been triggered based on the economic conditions of the state. Nancy, is there more information that might shed some light on that?
Well, yes, it's a concern for school districts that are trying to be very proactive about solvency of a school district. And so when this cap was put in place, everybody kept saying that those triggers will never take place. We'll never have a rainy day fund. We'll never have enough money to fund a full COLA. I mean, the economic uncertainties we had in 2008, 2009, all of those years so they were convinced that this would never be triggered. Well, it's not the case. The conditions have been triggered. So as we continue to lobby and as we continue to identify things that we need to lobby for, this cap in reserves is one that should not be in place, and not because school districts want to keep as much money as possible, but I'll share with you a scenario. We do multi-year projections, right? And so you want to save money at the beginning. If there's opportunities with one-time money, you start increasing your ending fund balance, but you're going to need it in a 3-year period and a 4-year period. So you're going to need more than 10% to be able to deliver on all of those promises that you made. And now you can't have those savings that are above 10% to help you mitigate these programs in the multiple years. So one of the other areas for advocacy would be for that cap not to be the case. And the interesting thing is that basic aid districts that have more money than they know what to do with, are allowed to keep that 10% there. They have no cap. They have no cap. And so they should be spending it. People that need to have a savings account so that we can plan for for the needs of the district. We can't do any of that planning. We have to somehow not have that money right off the gate. So I would ask for advocacy for that.
Thanks, Nancy. I think that's good perspective, and it's a balance of trying to spend today's dollars on today's students, which is obviously what we want to do. But I think, Nancy, as you're highlighting, when a district, and Fremont has been in this situation as well, as many districts have across the state, when you have a deficit in your budget, a structural deficit, you're eating away at that reserve each year. And so sometimes that first year reserve, or what we call the current year reserve, could be above 10, but with a structural deficit, you're eating away at that reserve over the next 2 years. And so it can play an important role. And this is the first time that it's been triggered, but it's been something that we've been watching each year, wondering if it will come into play. So great question and great catch on that detail. Trustee Jones.
No, just to go back to what Ann mentioned and you mentioned, CJ, about it doesn't matter how much money you pour at us right now, the labor pool isn't there. And this, for me, is an example of really the structural underfunding of public education that's happened for decades, is that you have over time made these careers less desirable, and that it took time for that to happen, and it doesn't rebound just because you add a bunch of money. It takes years to train teachers. It takes years to get certain professionals in place in the district. And so, what we've seen, we know that this isn't a problem just for Fremont Unified. It's in the region, it's in the state, it's national. We have districts in parts of the country that are bringing in the National Guard to provide certain services because there aren't the people to provide these services. So when we see the state wanting us to expand TK and wanting us to expand meal service and provide this 9-hour ELOP program, where are the people that are going to do that? And it's going to take a lot more than 5.33% COLA to help districts be able to hire the personnel and retain them that are going to make those programs possible. So, part of what I want to be talking to the legislators about is what are the provisions for districts if we are doing our very best to hire enough people and there just aren't enough people to get these programs off the ground that they're wanting us to provide? What sort of relief are we going to have in those cases? Are they going to increase the ratio of students to staff that we can have in TK if it comes down to it? Are they going to give us some kind of other relief if we just don't have the bodies to do what they're asking us to do? It's one of the questions, and I know I put this in my board questions, but with the 9-hour ELOP program, does that have to be provided by our certificated staff? Or is that going to be something that we can, contract out for, like before and after school programs that we contract out for? Would those qualify, or does it have to be certificated staff providing those? And then how do we get certificated staff who want to provide a 9-hour day? It's just, some of this stuff, it sounds good, but it doesn't make a lot of sense when you look at how it's going to work on the ground.
Yeah, Trustee Jones, I think that's a great perspective. As Susan had mentioned earlier, each district is in their own unique circumstance. And I was on a state call last week where there were rural districts across the state asking for a waiver for the TK initiative because they don't think they can staff it for next year. And so, each district across the state, roughly 1,000 of them, we're all in different places and in different situations. In terms of the ELOP, I know this won't be wildly surprising to anybody on this call. The state is still developing some of those things. So what we do know is that it does not need to be certificated staff. It can be similar to our after-school programs that exist currently. However, what we have seen is that there is an anticipation that there will be a set of standards that qualify for what is considered acceptable content, instruction, those types of things. So it won't have to be delivered by a certificated staff member, but we will have a framework, and that framework is what I'm describing from the state that hasn't been provided to us. So the ELOP is a new program, and most districts are using the planning year this year, including Fremont Unified, and then we'll be bringing that into reality next year. And the future years, there's some different provisions within the language depending on a district's unduplicated percentage. So we'll be looking very carefully at how to maximize the benefit of that program for our students and trying to create the best opportunities. So as we get close to wrapping up, are there any other things that the group would want to offer as consideration, feedback, thoughts related to the governor's budget proposal or our discussion today? All right. well. Hopefully I've given enough proper wait time. And I want to thank Associate Superintendent Pfeiffer for putting together the presentation. I want to thank everybody on the call today. I think we had more participation from all members of the task force today, and that's certainly something that we want to keep seeing. So thank you, everybody, for speaking up. And Patty is going to close us out.
Thank you. I wanted to advise that we do have a conflict for our February 22nd meeting. We have back-to-back, I think most of the trustees here, superintendent and myself, have back-to-back meetings that afternoon to include a couple of conflicts. So I'd like to see if we can move this meeting to 3:30. Would that be acceptable? Is there any conflict for anybody?
I'll check with my manager. Because it's during my work hours, Patty, but I
Is,
think
okay,
she'll
I
say
wasn't
yes.
sure if that was too early.
Well, I think she'll say yes. She's very kind.
Okay, maybe the hours could be made up. I don't know, some other time or in the morning. I'm sure you'll put an email.
Yeah, 3:30 in the morning. Bring it on. Yeah,
Any other
I'm
conflicts?
sure I can work it out.
Okay, I'm hearing none. All right, so 2/22, and we'll send you a reminder on that as well with the revision on the calendar. There's one other conflict for trustees and superintendent, and this is for the April 25th meeting. There is a conference happening. And so I am going to suggest to superintendent if we can cancel that meeting. And the only reason I would want to cancel it is because the May revise is going to happen closer to May 22nd. We already have a meeting scheduled for May 16th and June 13th. So for that, I was going to suggest to possibly modify those dates slightly and perhaps cancel out of those and schedule a May 31st meeting. And Associate Superintendent Pfeiffer, maybe you can help me determine what would be the best date to schedule the upcoming May meeting based on the May revise. And we can certainly communicate with you with regards to those dates a little bit later. So for now, we'll just go ahead and modify the February 22nd meeting.
Great. Thank you so much, Patty. And thank you, everybody else. The April conflict is when we will actually be in Washington advocating for funding for many things, but most specifically, I'll be harping on the fund special education as designed. So hopefully we'll get our point across. If
And
not,
transportation.
yes, we'll certainly be making our presence known. So thank you, everybody, for being here. We're going to, some of us will be transitioning into the board budget subcommittee meeting. And for those of you who are done with your meetings, thank you very much. And I hope you have a restful night.
Thank you.